It's a tragedy in the sense that a number of lives are being blocked and that there's great difficulty in them understanding why they've been blocked. On the other hand, there is, for me, the tragic sense of the ending, which is often taken as a kind of liberation. This is the first powerful introduction of what became a characteristic ending to a novel which has encountered, as Sons and Lovers does, major questions of social conflict, social growth, the pressure of work on personal lives and so on. That moment of walking away and seeing the lights, which has become almost the stereotype of liberation, of getting out from under an impossible situation. For me, that is more tragic than the situation that is being left, in the sense that to walk away from it with that much sensitivity, that much intelligence, and to feel that that is any kind of response to what is going to go on happening there. Of course, people grow up and develop and in that sense change and go away. But it's symptomatic in a way of Lawrence's encountering in the most important way in his generation what was really happening in the major parts of English industrial life, and right down from the most general questions of work to things inside the family and the most intimate relationships. And then thinking that this can be solved in terms of the development of one person, one individual. Especially if readers then add, and of course he goes away to be D.H. Lawrence, the world-famous novelist, which makes the thing not tragedy but ironic farce, if people add that, which is not, of course, in the book.
Lawrence then writes about transformation.
Yeah.
About the kind of possibilities of transformation, and is certainly not blind to the tragic possibilities of them, I don't think. The major one being the war. It completely transformed his attitudes to women, certainly to the working class, certainly to community. I wonder if you have any comment on the range of the kinds of transformations he undergoes, the kinds of pressures he is under, and whether or not it's the first time he suddenly realises that he needs a sense of impending crisis to actually drive his writing in a certain direction.
I think that it was possible for people before 1914 to think that they were radical and that they wanted to see the world entirely changed and that they knew what was evil in it and so on. But the experience of the war, even indirectly, as people in England had it, the feedback of a certain kind of spirits about the war, as well as the actual killing that was going on, put this into a new dimension. I mean, the arguments which had almost a debating society air in certain circles before 1914, where people had talked about civilization collapsing, the pillars of society falling, all the metaphors are commonplace in that period, but suddenly something very like this was happening, and the discontinuity in the normal tenor of English life seems to have been remarkable. It's certainly something that he closely describes, and on this I think you always have to allow with Lawrence for his own highly individual reading of some situation, but I think on this he's entirely central. Something did break in those years of the war, and all I'd say is you can't idealize it by saying it was something good and secure in the old civilization. Also what broke was the complacency, and most of the assumptions of how, with a few small reforms, the order could be tidied up and improved. Indeed, the people who had been talking of of a fundamental crisis of civilization were the people, and they were very few, were the people who, so to say, saw it being played out in reality. Lawrence is very early in this respect to take it at that depth. On the other hand, in what terms do you then describe it? All through the war, he doesn't know. Because in a way, the general phrases about it are already so well known. He's trying to get at the sense of what it could be, and if there is any alternative to it. Hence these attempts to link up with this or that group, which is, however, still living in that pre-war world in which a few minor institutions of attitude would meet a crisis of this scale. I think Lawrence he doesn't find solutions, and he has some very bad moments in which he seems almost to surrender to the horror of it. On the other hand, he's treating it as the kind of crisis it is, which is life or death. I mean, it's not a minor improvement or anything of that kind by that stage. And the fact that this was then to some extent reconstituted after the war ended, I mean, we can now see that that crisis has been continuous from that time to this, even although there have been intervals of peace, and that it is the kind of crisis which came again when people really understood what nuclear weapons were or something. It's that sort of scale. And then it's not surprising that it's at once very intense, very large, but also there are no available terms and no available organizations which are quite responding in his time to that kind of crisis.
Seems to be virtually alone in looking at it from the perspective of the home front.
Yes.
I don't know anything quite as powerful about that kind of consequence of the war, with the consequence of the war on the home front in the 19th century.
Of picking up the very ugly things that happen when people are, so to say, manipulated into war, and this did happen, when all sorts of traps are sprung, that the rather innocent songs about empire and nation and king, which children have sung at school, I mean, as just sets of words, you know, are suddenly activated by politicians and generals, and this happens frequently in that stage of war, that in a sense what comes to the surface is a kind of ugly rejoicing in what is eventually seen as disastrous, and this split particularly between the people who were merely activating those images and the people who, of course, getting involved in the fighting, who quite quickly had the images blown to pieces and tried to tell people what it was really like, and were not believed because fed back at them was this same stuff. Now, what Lawrence hit most was this stuff at home, which was lies and every kind of false glorification. And in that moment, I mean, it had extraordinary effects on his development. He said, well, people have got no sense. People can't be trusted. People have got no judgment. Which is a fair thing to say when you're opposing the judgments people are making, but immediately with Lawrence it becomes an absolute statement about people for all time and a reason against democracy and so on, which would be nonsense. But he picked up the ugliness, and there were 2 months of the Falklands War in which many people felt like Lawrence feeling about that, not just what was happening in the fighting, but this extraordinary ugly exaltation which passes, but while it's happening, it's profoundly disturbing, and it can make people lose faith in others, and that's a sort of deterioration, because once you start saying nobody's good enough to get us out of this crisis, who can we trust, what causes, what institutions, then the thing goes on down, and that's probably the worst spiritual result of great crises like that. The people lose hope, even in the hopeful.
There's also the in the first novel as he's coming to a head. And as a consequence, I think, in some ways, unfortunately, the whole rhetoric of war begins to penetrate his language. I mean, he talks about placing mines under the establishment, and,
Yes.
blowing up,
Yes.
established ideas, things like that. Do you see that as yet another of the kind of ambivalences or ambiguities in his character? You know, that he is the sign of his kind of closeness to community. The impossibility of him actually divorcing himself from social concerns. That he inherits the kind of language of the thing.
Well, he did move as a writer, and in a way, what else as a writer at that time could he have done? He moved into circles which could not take most parts of his experience seriously. They could not take really seriously the realities of working life as something of people. I mean, they could understand the problem of the workers, the more sympathetic could. But to see that this wasn't a problem of the workers, but of people in all the variety that Lawrence knew them, then I think that he picked up this sense that there was a sympathetic, enlightened, educated class, although whenever he met their representatives, he immediately recoiled from them, I think rightly. But they said that there was a lot of ugly, stupid militancy, and that was the world that, of course, he, having been educated and being a genius and so on, wouldn't sympathize with. And he was pulled both ways. I mean, about something like the strikes and the whole notion of irreconcilable conflicts. But after all, no one more than Lawrence ever emphasized the fact of absolutely irreconcilable conflicts. I mean, he's not a man who's talking about minor adjustments and sensible compromises. He is saying it's life or death, that there are these forces driving us to destroy our lives and make them ugly. He's less certain about what the forces are which are moving in the other direction, but he knows that there's no compromise between them. And yet, of course, the particular language of the political expression of that in terms of class war and so on, he was in a sense inoculated against. He flirts with it, but then he flirts with uglier versions of it too, from the right. And I think by that time his connections were so loose that he couldn't understand that the way other people represent a militant working class movement is not how the workers themselves conceive it or their spirit while they're active in it. He could only see it, as it were, from the other side as ugliness and violence and so on. At the same time, he was pulled back to knowing that these were boys he'd been to school with. These were the wives and daughters of his own generation, and that there was a life connection between them, and he couldn't bear to see the suffering happening. He didn't find his way through that, but he picked it up in a real sense.
I think the kind of consequences of those violent fluctuations and the reasons, the lack of equanimity that suffered, during the war, obviously is, what drives him into Women in Love and what makes it so peculiar a novel. In modern tragedy, you talk about sort of like a sort of duality of tragic tragedy, sort of like the alienation from the possibilities of the self as well as the alienation from the possibilities of community and society. Now, it seems to me that Women in Love is actually precisely that.
Yeah.
It's a very firm embodiment of that. And I wondered if you had any ideas as to why that tragedy, which Lawrence himself so firmly represents as tragedy, is so often taken as a signal of his triumph as both artist and man.
I've been puzzled for years why people see Women in Love as the achievement of a new state of consciousness from which people can learn and go on. I think that precisely it is the laying bare of almost impossible contradictions, which incidentally changed the whole form of his fiction, and it's a fiction that is reduced to a single generation and to almost schematic relationships and oppositions. When I hear people talk about this as the witness for humanity, or the achievement of an aesthetic position which is above the relative crudeness, you know, or what is described as the simple naturalism of the early tales. You know, that's a very common way of putting it. I simply do not know what they're talking about. I mean, absolutely uncomprehending. And when you're in that state of mind, it must mean that you're not failing to understand individuals. You're up against a culture. You're up against a bloc. And it must be that, because I think that at the time when more and more people were realizing that these mutual interlocking failures didn't have simple ways out. The whole process of aestheticizing failure, aestheticizing defeat, draining away the sort of challenge into contemplating its form. I believe it now, I could give hundreds of other examples, I think, was the settlement of some of the most sensitive, most concerned people, but people who hadn't anything like the drive of Lawrence to realize that you couldn't leave it like that. And that when you had achieved this particular form, all the forces were still there that would, as is very Lawrence thing to say, that would keep disrupting it. I mean, precisely that is not a stable form which could be lived with and contemplated and seen as beautiful. All the forces which are temporarily held in it will break out, will disrupt. I mean, this is evident. And so it requires one to isolate the text and take it all away from the forces that drive into it. But then, of course, that suits some people. I mean, there are people who have believed for a long time that nothing can be done in any of these areas except read, which is better than simply saying nothing can be done, but not much. I mean, if they truly believe nothing can be done, this is less bad than the continual teaching that nothing can be done. And I have seen Women in Love and similar works, and that reading of them used to teach that nothing can be done. Which is not, I think, a Lawrence conclusion, but simply that the harder you push, I mean, it's a deadlock kind of novel in that way. The harder you push, because the forces are so strange, the more it's insoluble. Unless you move into a different dimension, unless there's a whole sense that from somewhere there's some force that is going to liberate.
I think part of the problem with regard to Women in Love is, I think Lawrence himself says, you know, that it's seemingly historically unfixed.
Yeah.
And if we began to reconstitute, you know, the kind of environment in which it was written and in which it was produced,
Yeah.
It would become clear to us that indirectly, you know, it is a very socially concerned book. You know, it's not an individual testament.
Yeah. Well, when he goes on to the same characters in that play Touch and Go, for example, you can see how conscious he was of the threads back, you know, of where the money for the tour comes from, of where what the work is, what attitudes are bred in there that you take, whether you know it or not, in your luggage, in your head. I mean, in that sense, it's only a very temporary crystallization from this much wider and more active living, social, historical situation. It is simply that when people, and the crystallization is an interesting and impressive process, but when people use it to put down things like Sons and Lovers and the early stories, which they see as still cluttered with the detail of a real place and a working life and family and so on, then one knows they are using that novel in a quite opposite direction, not as crystallization, but as a cancellation of that kind of involvement. And then I think, as a matter of fact, they're not even reading Women in Love very deeply. I mean, if you make that sort of thing relatively timeless, I mean, it isn't, it doesn't have the dimensions that some of the more plausibly timeless tragic situations do, which are about bigger things. So much of this is a matter of relationship, social attitude, sexual attitude, artistic attitude. This is what's in play, quite rightly, because it's of its world. Yeah.
Seems to me the sort of book then that could be a considerable challenge to us, as a modern audience, in terms of the way in which we are going to construct a past context and the view of a writer, and to assess the kinds of concerns we bring to literary evaluation.
I think this is right, because if people pick up Lawrence as this vagrant, and as so often read the struggle through the point at which it's presumed to have reached, not actually ever did reach in Lawrence, but in the sort of a kind of false canonization of a version of Lawrence which got around. Then you read back through this and you get the sense of a man who is not only moving away, for which there are very strong social, cultural reasons, from the working environment in which he was raised, but in this version he is seen as raising himself above considerations and concerns like that, whereas whole importance of Lawrence is how close he is to that, and actually how close he remains to it even on the travels. I mean, this involvement, not when he's going off into the great abstractions of nature or time or society or what may be, but in that kind of detailed material involvement, he carried through something which was distinctively a part of his own common culture. I mean, that there is a physicality, there is a proper attention to the material. There is no sense of the material needing to be displaced to servants or to the margins of life or to the inconveniences of life. This is life, this handling material. Now, if all that is suppressed in the later account, or seen simply as his idiosyncrasy, and the early involvement which was direct in his own place seen as something which, of course, as a real artist, he had to get away from, then we've missed everything that's important about Lawrence. There is no connection. It's significant that that version of him should have been so widely propagated, especially since his time, more and more people have gone through versions of the Lawrence social experience. And to them what is important is the way it comes out as they go on into different kind of life. Not this, what would become at its weakest, this simple evasion and exoticism. Yeah.
The image you mentioned at the end of Sons of Lovers for that kind of evasion.
Yeah.
It's very much, as much as it's a novelistic image, it's a film image.
Yes.
I know in your own work you're very opposed to the idea of technological determinacy, the idea that there's something wrong with the medium in themselves.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether you thought there were any particular reasons particular to what you might call television culture, why such an image is one that's endlessly recirculated and is one that's used to position artists like Lawrence again.
It's difficult to know because it straddles so many forms. I mean, I once began collecting examples and they became too numerous. I think there are certain conveniences to television. I mean, in certain kind of serial or series, I mean, it's useful to have a person dropping the material of that particular encounter and simply going on to the new set of persons. There's the continual presentation of the interesting and important individual as mobile, isolated. But this comes from this deeper movement in the culture, I think, not from the technology, that this was seen as the easy form of dissidence, you know, that you walk away from it. And while there were still places to walk to, which is the illusion of so many American films, that there are places to walk to where it will be different. But I'm not sure that it is inherent in the technology, and it's so curious in a period in which there are probably less independent souls per 1,000 of the population who would walk the other way than in many other periods which had much more emphasis on social settlements. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's the fantasy which is necessary in a time of conformity.
Your own work's been concerned with the idea of a common culture.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I asked about television is that you've indicated ways in which television both can offer and deny a version of community.
Yeah.
Now I wondered what you would consider to be positive and negative in what the example of an artist like yours in considering, in trying to work towards that kind of possibility.
It interested me very much when the Lawrence short stories were adapted for television, that he was writing material which seemed made, I don't just mean for the medium, because I don't think that means enough on its own, but for the medium with that audience. Because that they were short stories was interesting. It didn't get into the complexities of the longer narratives. But that particular faculty of going in very close on a situation, on a relationship, and in a reproducible social environment or in some work situation, there was the glimpse of an alternative television for which to say the audience was already formed. Now these have not been the only examples. Whenever people have seriously tried to do this in television, they've found that the audience is there. And in that sense, I don't accept the arguments that television as an impersonal technology is going to have an alienated mass audience necessarily. I think that in many ways people were waiting for kinds of work, which Lawrence is one of the early examples, which really do try to recreate a totality and a communality of experience. Above all, in the kinds of colloquial terms that Lawrence could use. And I think this is so important, that in the writing all through, in the narrative and so on, it's different in the essays, but in the stories, he adapts English prose to the rhythms of speech and a lot of the vocabulary of speech in a remarkable way, which really is a big cultural shift. And it's always the sign when he's getting beyond his resources and beyond anything he can understand, when he has to take up again this language which everybody instantly identifies as Laurentian, certain of the jargon words, which are always a sign that he can't find everyday language for them. What is remarkable is how much everyday and colloquial language he found for quite complicated ideas and descriptions and relationships, and he found those rhythms and communicated them. And I suppose that is what one means by a common culture, and the possibility of using a medium as a common culture, that people can find connecting words and rhythms which don't sacrifice the complexity and intensity of life, which people know is there, and they don't want it made difficult, but they don't want it simplified either. I think in that sense, the best uses of the modern media have been foreshadowed in artists who came rather before them, who were looking for that kind of use. I think this is so in Lawrence's case anyway.
I wonder if you could apply these ideas to the term best. These arguments in themselves, in the term best.
Yeah.
What happens is that Lawrence tries to connect the present turbulence, and what he falls back on is a kind of idealized romanticism,
Yeah.
popular memory version of his own past. It seems to me that does affect the actual text of the kind of colloquial language that he's attempting, which
Yes.
many people call it the image text.
Mm.
And it seems to me that that attempt to idealize and recreate a popular memory is a positive one. It's
Mm.
one that often takes in that essay, and often in television is one that we want to be very careful about.
Mm.
I wonder if we could just apply that kind of thinking to this.
Well, I think the Return to Bestwood and Nothing in the Mining Countryside are extraordinarily interesting. I mean, that they should always be seen as a real stage in Lawrence's writing, rather than swept up at the end as minor pieces. Of course, there is one general problem, that for anybody revisiting a working community in which they've been raised, of the memories being of childhood and the encounter not only from an adult experience of a very different kind, but the encounter with adults. I mean, it is characteristic of all these things that there is the child's memory of what was nevertheless at the time primarily an adult's world, and those crossovers. On the other hand, what he was saying was that there was the possibility of a direction. Those if only this potential had been drawn on. He's never clear about who is to do it, but he is seeing the possibility of the transformation where it mattered, where it concerned him, which is so different from the earlier mood that you simply have to get out as they get away, or the interpretation other people loaded on him that he only became important when he got away. The only serious transformations, after all, would be in places like that. Otherwise, there would be transformations. And I think that it's a very difficult thing in the whole of the thought of the last 200 years to separate the idealizations of some earlier period from their recurrent use as radical images of the future, or of the possibilities of the future. I mean, there are times when you simply have to reject them because they're being projected as something which has been irretrievably lost since people were educated, or since people had the vote, or something like that. You know, there's that use of the old happier state which must not be tolerated for a moment, because it's always invoked really to stop some of the best things that have since happened. On the other hand, from Cobbett through, even when you can know in narrow factual terms that they're wrong about the world they're writing, remembering, recalling, it seems to be a major resource in projecting the possibility of a future, as if saying at least the past was different, which means the present is not unalterable. It's that kind of argument. And at times Lawrence is doing that. And this curious way in which a version of the past becomes a future is one of the hardest things to understand, because once you state it too simply, you're into other uses which sound the same, which are nothing like, which are not defensible at all. When they're used to cancel out everything that people do. And Lawrence does this when he talks about industry as such, you know, rather than talking about very specific organization of industry which did certain things to certain people.
For all the reasons you just outlined, it may be worth our while as an audience to value excuse me, those two essays above Lady Chatterley's Lover, in the sense that Lady Chatterley's Lover represents, I think, a far more conventionalized response to the same kind of set of historical events. It seems to me that it falls back on the assurances of myth, of the possibility of healthy sexual relationship, offering some sort of past transformative kind of possibility. It seems to me to be a novel that could almost be said to be based entirely on the kind of rhetorical sense of transcendence you get at the end of the rainbow.
I think it's largely so, although it's very interesting to follow the three versions through and to see that at times he was clearly trying to make it more than what it does eventually become, which is a kind of formula, simplification, to change the world in those ways. Yes, I think a lot of importance has to be given to those two essays and to this whole mood, the retrospective comments of a biographical kind on his father and so on, the reperception from adult life of what it was to be a working man and not just a child in a working class home, which is a very different situation. And he died at 45, which is just the sort of period when that kind of reassessment is at its most critical. So I think, yes, we value that late work. And the intensity and the anger that is still there, often of an unreconstructed kind. Sometimes it sounds like an angry adolescent from inside that community for a moment, and then it's this very different man taking over.
Do you think the three versions of Lady Chatterley's Lover, in spite of what it, almost in spite of what it becomes eventually, do give us a fairly, how shall I put it, honest and true kind of sense of Lawrence always being able to reassess himself? I'm thinking of the way in which Parkin gradually becomes mellowed and also gradually becomes more articulate,
yes,
and also more involved in social discourses, and turns his back upon social discourses not out of ignorance but out of choice.
yes.
That would seem to defeat the kind of myths and assurances, would it not, that Lawrence comes out with in the final version of the novel?
Yes, I think in that sense it was something he never could finish. I think, and I think the tensions inside it are so extraordinary, and not least the tensions about sexuality, which again don't really accord with the myth, I think, because there are real tensions about potency and impotence and so on, all through that writing of the early and mid-20s, which sometimes the rhetoric overrides and sometimes engages with. It's a very mixed and unfinished case, I think.
As far as the prepared questions ago,
Yeah.
I think we've just about done it.
Yeah.
Depending on how much
That one you had about the future, I didn't know you wanted.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Or we can,
I thought you'd
Oh,
probably picked up on that.
Although we've probably done it already.
yeah, I was quite satisfied.
Anyway, you've got lots of material now.
Okay. Is there a lot of tape?
There's 18 minutes of tape left.
If you wouldn't mind us just asking a couple of quick
That's all right.
Should we ask
Yes.
you a few sort of general questions?
Yeah.
You start. Well, I mean, to recap on the one about the future, you know, as I've said, it seems to me that you clearly wanted whole enterprise, especially at certain points, people in terms of possibilities for the future. And you've diagnosed as an element in our contemporary crisis,
Mm.
the failure of sense of the future, as part of the kind of tragic deadlock that
Mm.
you see in women in love. Can you see anything in the text themselves that offers some kind of positive contribution to the unblocking of that contemporary crisis?
I think it's very difficult to get past the sort of simple examples Lawrence gives of how you could have a different kind of community. I mean, a different way of building, a different attitude to clothes, different attitude to work and dress and play and so on, all those things, I'm sure. But they're not really addressing some of the central problems, which precisely, I think, his whole development steered him away from. In particular, he never really confronts the problem of capitalism. I mean, because it can be swept up as part of the evil. It doesn't have to be discriminated, and therefore there's no alternative social order really described. It's part of that vision of a more colourful, more active, more sharing, more communal. I mean, he keeps stressing that in the later thing, that we've lost the civic sense, we've lost the communal sense, which is a very curious emphasis from the person who'd been projected and in part had projected himself as this single individual. He talks about the lack of a civic, lack of a communal sense, often in a kind of rhetorical comparison with Italian towns or something of that kind, or some period of the past. But clearly that's the stress he's trying to get. And then it is the problem that the future is being seen as the gathering of these resources, these emphases, these possible directions, but institutionally don't quite know how it'll be done and what, there aren't any movements you can join and this sort of thing. You've got to keep proud and independent. And then this other feeling, which is, so to say, transferring the future out of the species. Life is going to be undefeated, you know. A very strong sense he has of living creatures. It goes into this, that these other living creatures, you know, have gone through this ugly phase and destructive phase that we have. They'll survive. And that sense which is also there at the end of the rainbow. Not just the vision of something transformed, but also the vision of an earth swept clean of humanity, so that all there is the grass and the animals and the birds, and this whole era, so to say, has been wiped out. The life process takes over. It's part of the same feeling in a way, but it is very easily converted and almost converts itself into some of the most negative images that have since been around as the prospect of something like that, of total annihilation, has become technically possible. That precisely in impatience at the profound difficulties and the intolerable delays and the endless capacity for self-deception and the endless failures of good enterprises and the endless successes of the evil and the stupid. I mean, it's a very easy state of mind to get into, you know, it sweeps a lot away. I've heard victims in contemporary society saying it would be a good thing if the bomb dropped and cleared the lot out of it. And this is one of the ways in which exposure to the reality of the suffering can become, and it very quickly gets used as an agency for actually making it more probable. And there are times when Lawrence is doing this Yabu, I hate humanity, Pui and so on stuff, when the only response would be, in his terms, to kick his ass. I mean, because it really is not a thing a decent man should say, which is another sort of phrase of his. To say, I can't stand people behaving like this, you know, what you are saying disgusts me, what you're doing disgusts me. Face somebody, tell them, go through a phase when there's deep disappointment and argue, be angry about it. But to go off into this easy stuff about hating humanity, and which is, it's only part of him, but it was the part that was prepared, and it's the weakness that comes out of that kind of dissidence, I think. It's almost encouraged. Go on, be even more fatalistic, you know, be pessimistic, show us the degradation of humanity. It makes a lovely evening in the theatre, and there's a sense in which that's been a cultural phase. And Lawrence gave them just enough to use in that respect, and within his own culture and in his best. I mean, that sort of conclusion has to be simply refused. It's not a reasonable conclusion.
Can I just change the sort of emphasis of discussion slightly and ask you whether you had any thoughts about this, and that is that in trying to reconstitute, in a sense, the kind of idiom in which Lawrence's works were
Yeah.
and an idiom that they can be read through video and television.
Right.
We're obviously doing two things. I mean, in one sense, we're attempting to entertain, and in the other sense, we're attempting to instruct.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we're reproducing, however unwittingly, some of the contradictions of the medium itself in doing that, in the sense that entertainment and education, as far as television is generally concerned, tend to be things which do not combine easily.
Right.
I wonder if you have any thoughts on any of the possible dangers of the kinds of projects in which we're involved.
I don't really see dangers. I think that the fact that very powerful images can be imposed, and that Lawrence in particular has been constructed in so many images which are endlessly reproduced, well, it's bound to make one wary of using images to represent him at all. But what's interested me is the sense of replacing this image of Lawrence in what is, after all, undeniably, unarguably his world, the world in which his perceptions were formed, in which he was raised, and where it is no case of simply replacing him in that, because that would be to cancel the whole development, but to see him in that perspective, this is right. And I do believe that if you have a culture as soaked with images as this, you're going to be so surrounded by misrepresentations and simplifications that you can get the recoil from the medium, so to say, which some people have, as if it had never happened in every medium, you know, because it's a widely dispersed medium, people see it and they see so much misrepresentation and image simplification that the only answer to them is other representations, and the representation which is after all not simply interpretation, but is unarguably there, as this was Lawrence's world, and that world is continuous, and just as the reading of Lawrence has been continuous, so the mining of the coal and the conflicts that he saw as a child and saw all their consequences working through, those are contemporary and continuous too. That both can be read alongside each other as continuing connecting processes, and if it's the image of that, then it's a right image, I think.
far as our own purposes are concerned, I think
Yeah.
we've got more than enough.
Yes, I'm sure you have.
So we could
It's good.
let you off the hook.
Well, that's very nice, yes.